Right now, 23 oil tankers are sitting motionless in the water around a small island in the Persian Gulf. They are not moving, they are not loading, they are not leaving. Some of them have been anchored there for weeks. Others arrived more recently, hoping to pick up crude oil from the most important piece of land in the entire Iranian economy and finding that there is nowhere to go. The island is called Kharg. It is 20 miles off the Iranian coast. It handles 90% of every barrel of oil Iran exports. And as of today, the storage tanks on that island are so full that satellite images show the floating roofs inside the tanks have risen almost to the top of the walls. The shadows that those tank walls used to cast across the rooftops have nearly disappeared. That is how analysts know the tanks are full. They measure the shadows. Iran is not running out of oil. Iran is drowning in it. The country is producing more crude than it can store, more crude than it can ship, more crude than it can sell, and the American naval blockade sitting between Kharg Island and every buyer on Earth is the reason why. By the end of this video, you will fully understand how a single small island became the choke point of the entire Iranian economy, why the United States deliberately bombed everything on Kharg except the oil infrastructure, why 23 tankers are sitting in the water going nowhere, and why Iran may have already passed the point where its own oil production begins destroying the equipment that produces it. Let us start with what Kharg Island actually is, because most people have never heard of it, and it might be the single most strategically important piece of real estate in this entire war. Kharg Island is roughly 5 miles long and 3 miles wide. It sits in the northern Persian Gulf, connected to the Iranian mainland by underwater pipelines that carry crude oil from Iran's largest oil fields. On the island, there are massive storage tanks, loading terminals, and a series of jetties where supertankers pull alongside and take on cargo. On a normal day before this war started, Kharg was exporting between 1.1 and 1.6 million barrels of crude oil per day. That oil went overwhelmingly to one customer, China, which bought roughly 90% of Iran's crude exports, paying in yuan and cryptocurrency rather than American dollars. The storage capacity on Kharg Island is approximately 30 to 34 million barrels of crude, plus another 5 to 7 million barrels of refined products. Before the blockade, roughly 18 million barrels were already in storage. That left somewhere between 12 and 16 million barrels of spare capacity. At Iran's production rate of approximately 1 million barrels per day flowing into Kharg through the pipelines, that spare capacity was enough to last roughly 2 to 3 weeks before the tanks would be physically full. That was the math in mid-April when the American blockade went into effect. Today, 5 weeks later, the math has run out. On March 13th, 2 weeks after the war began, the United States Air Force conducted a massive bombing raid on Kharg Island. More than 90 Iranian military sites on the island were destroyed. Anti-aircraft batteries, Revolutionary Guard command posts, radar installations, ammunition depots. Every piece of military hardware on the island was reduced to rubble. But here's the part that changes the entire strategic picture. The United States deliberately left the oil infrastructure untouched. Every storage tank, every pipeline, every loading terminal, every jetty was left standing. This was not an accident. This was not a failure of targeting. This was a calculated decision made at the highest levels of the Pentagon and approved by President Trump personally. The logic was simple and devastating. If you destroy the oil infrastructure, Iran has nothing left to lose. If you leave the oil infrastructure standing but prevent Iran from using it, Iran has everything to lose and a clock ticking toward the moment when it loses it. That clock has now reached its final phase. European satellite images taken on May 8th, 9th, and 11th showed something unprecedented. For the first time since the war began, there were 0 ocean-going tankers at Kharg Island's loading berths for 3 consecutive days. The jetties were empty. No ships were loading. The terminal that handles 90% of Iran's oil exports had gone completely idle. That has never happened for more than a single day since the war started on February 28th. Before that 3-day halt, Iran had been loading tankers and using them as floating storage, filling ships and leaving them anchored nearby because the American blockade prevented them from leaving the Gulf. But by the second week of May, even that workaround had reached its limit. The tankers were full, the storage tanks were full, the pipelines from the mainland were still pumping, and the oil had nowhere left to go. By May 16th, satellite imagery confirmed 23 tankers gathered around Kharg Island, compared to 4 on April 13th, the day before the blockade went into effect. The buildup is the largest concentration of idle vessels at Kharg since the war began. Some are anchored in deep water. Others are berthed at crude-loading jetties that would normally turn ships around in hours. At least one vessel was spotted at a liquefied petroleum gas terminal normally used for cooking fuel, not crude storage. Iran is using every available berth and vessel to absorb oil that cannot leave. As of May 17th, United States Central Command reported that American forces had turned away 81 commercial vessels and disabled 4 ships. The blockade is not a fence. It is a machine that grinds down every attempt to move oil out of Iran, and each week fewer ships approach, fewer insurers cover the cargo, and fewer captains risk their crews. Now stop and think about what happens when a country's oil storage fills up completely. Oil production is not a faucet you can turn off and on. When crude comes out of the ground, it flows under pressure from reservoirs deep beneath the surface, maintained by a complex balance of gas, water, and rock formations in equilibrium for millions of years. When you shut in a well, that equilibrium changes. Pressure buildups damage the wellbore. Water migrates into zones where it was not present. Equipment designed to operate continuously corrodes when idle. Restarting a shut-in field can take weeks to months, and in some cases the field never fully recovers. A percentage of the oil becomes permanently trapped. Iran's engineers know this. Every day that Kharg sits full is a day closer to shutting in fields that may never come back. There's another layer to this crisis that emerged on May 8th, and that most American news outlets barely covered. Satellite imagery confirmed an 80,000-barrel oil leak from Kharg Island into the Persian Gulf. A slick stretching across 27 square miles of water was visible from space. Some intelligence analysts believe Iran deliberately released the oil to relieve pressure on a system that was reaching physical limits. Others believe the leak was the result of infrastructure failure, that valves and seals designed for normal operations simply could not handle the sustained overpressure of a system with no outlet. Either way, the leak tells you something specific. Kharg Island's infrastructure is operating outside its design parameters. The system was built to move oil through, not to hold oil in place indefinitely. Holding it in place is breaking it. Iran has attempted workarounds. The country reactivated a 30-year-old supertanker called the Nasha and repositioned it as floating storage. Additional crude has been diverted through the Goreh-Jask pipeline, an alternative route that bypasses the Gulf entirely. But Jask's capacity is a fraction of Kharg's, and the pipeline was only partially completed before the war. Iran has also begun flaring massive quantities of natural gas at its oil fields, burning off gas to reduce wellhead pressure and buy additional days before full shutdown. Satellite emission services have recorded a significant increase in flaring since early May. Flaring is not a solution. It is a distress signal visible from space. The economic numbers behind this crisis are the ones that connect Kharg Island to the negotiating table in Islamabad. Washington estimates that Iran is losing roughly $500 million per day in oil revenue due to the blockade. That is $15 billion per month. Iran's hard currency reserves, the dollars and euros it needs to import food, medicine, and industrial goods, are being burned through at a rate that gives the regime somewhere between 60 and 90 days before the money runs out entirely. The Kharg crisis accelerates that timeline because every day that production is curtailed is a day of revenue that can never be recovered, even after the blockade ends. The oil stays in the ground. The money never arrives. President Pezeshkian, Iran's elected president, has reportedly warned inside the Iranian government that without a ceasefire, the economy faces total collapse within 3 weeks to 1 month. That warning was made weeks ago. The clock he described is now approaching zero. But the Revolutionary Guard, which controls the military infrastructure and the Strait of Hormuz toll system, has refused to allow the concessions that would be necessary to end the blockade. The same dynamic that killed the April 17th Strait announcement when the foreign minister opened the waterway and the Guard shut it down within hours is playing out again on Kharg Island. The diplomats see the math, the military sees the power, and nobody in Tehran can force a resolution. Think about what this looks like from the perspective of an American military planner sitting in Central Command headquarters in Tampa, Florida. The United States spent trillions of dollars building a navy that can fight and win against any fleet on Earth. But the weapon that is actually ending this war is not a missile, not a fighter jet, not an aircraft carrier. The weapon that is ending this war is patience. The American blockade does not need to fire another shot. It does not need to sink another ship. It does not need to bomb Kharg Island's oil tanks, which it deliberately left standing for exactly this reason. All it needs to do is sit there day after day, week after week, while the oil backs up, the tanks fill, the fields shut down, and the money stops. So here is the question that the 23 tankers anchored around Kharg Island are forcing every government on Earth to answer. The Iranian economy is drowning in its own oil. Storage is full. Production is being curtailed. Revenue has collapsed. The infrastructure is leaking. The Revolutionary Guard refuses to make a deal. And somewhere beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf, 4,000 mines that nobody can find are preventing even the ships that want to move from moving safely. Is this the moment when Iran's regime finally breaks, when the economic pressure becomes so overwhelming that even the Revolutionary Guard cannot justify holding out any longer? Or is this the moment when a desperate regime with nothing left to lose does something catastrophic, because a government that cannot feed its soldiers and cannot sell its oil and cannot fix its own infrastructure is a government that has run out of rational options? One side says the blockade has already won, that the tankers sitting motionless around Kharg Island are the image of a regime in its final weeks. The other side says a cornered regime is the most dangerous regime on Earth, and that 23 idle tankers are not a sign of victory but a countdown to something much worse. Write your answer in the comments, because the people who say this is the endgame and the people who say this is the beginning of the most dangerous phase are about to have the most important argument on this channel. And if you have not seen our breakdown of the one-page 14-point deal that could end this war in 30 days and why both sides are terrified to sign it, make sure to watch that one next.